They walked through the newly lit streets of New York and Chicago in gowns of silk and velvet, their faces powdered to a delicate, almost translucent whiteness. They were the symbols of America's Gilded Age, the embodiment of progress, wealth, and a new era of refinement. But beneath the corsets, the lace, and the powdered paint, their bodies were often battlegrounds of filth and decay, their elegant clothes hiding sores that festered in silence. They were not simply suffering. They were being erased from the inside out by the very rituals that were meant to make them beautiful. Tonight we will pull back the perfumed curtain of the 1880s and step into the hidden world of American women's hygiene. We will uncover the secrets they endured, the poisons they embraced, and the profound silence that allowed it all to happen. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, perhaps turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let the quiet of the room settle around you as we begin. If you were to step into the home of a respectable American family in the 1880s, you would be greeted by an air of order, polished wood, heavy curtains, and the faint scent of coal smoke or wood polish. But another scent lingered just beneath the surface, one that was universally understood yet never spoken of: the smell of the unwashed human body. Daily bathing, a ritual we consider fundamental, was not just uncommon, it was actively discouraged. Water, especially in rapidly growing cities, was often a commodity. It had to be hauled from a public pump or drawn from a well, then laboriously heated over a fire, bucket by bucket. For a woman already tasked with cooking, cleaning, and childcare, the prospect of a full bath was a monumental effort reserved for rare occasions, perhaps once a week, or in many households far less. The portable tin or copper tubs were filled, used, and then had to be emptied by hand, a back-breaking process that made the entire affair a dreaded chore rather than a moment of relief. But the resistance to bathing went deeper than mere inconvenience. A pervasive fear inherited from earlier generations held that water was a dangerous element. Doctors and popular health manuals warned that immersing the body, especially in warm water, opened the pores to miasmas and airborne diseases. It was believed that a layer of natural body oil and accumulated dirt provided a protective barrier against sickness. To wash it away was to invite illness into the body. Women were particularly warned against the dangers of cold water, which was thought to cause everything from nervous shock to infertility. So they endured, believing their filth was a shield. The result was a society where body odor was a constant, unspoken presence. In the close confines of a parlor, at a church service, or inside a crowded streetcar, the air would be thick with the smell of stale sweat, unwashed hair, and poorly laundered clothes. Yet, the code of respectability demanded that no one ever acknowledge it. To mention the smell would be an act of profound vulgarity. And so women smiled, fanned themselves with an air of delicacy, and pretended not to notice the stench that clung to everyone, including themselves. It is almost absurd that a culture so obsessed with outward appearances and moral purity chose to live in a state of collective denial about the most basic element of cleanliness. The family bath, when it did occur, was a ritual of shared filth. The same tub of cooling gray water would be used by the entire family, one person after another. The father, as head of the household, would go first, followed by his sons, then his wife, and finally his daughter. By the time the last girl stepped into the tub, she was soaking in a lukewarm soup of dirt, skin flakes, and soap scum left by everyone else. This was not seen as disgusting. It was seen as efficient. The illusion of cleanliness was performed, but the reality was a ritualized exchange of grime. Perfumes and scented powders were the weapons used to fight this silent war against odor. Women would dab lavender water behind their ears or dust rice powder under their arms. But these fragrances only mingled with the underlying smell of sweat, creating a cloying, heavy scent that was often more unpleasant than the odor it was meant to hide. If we compare this to modern times, it would be like choosing to never shower and instead dousing yourself in a bottle of cheap air freshener each morning, all while insisting you were upholding the highest standards of personal hygiene. The consequences of this avoidance were etched onto their skin, pores clogged with a mixture of sweat, dirt and powder. Rashes, boils and fungal infections were a constant misery. Hidden beneath layers of clothing, women endured itching and burning in silence, often blaming their delicate female constitutions rather than the simple, glaring lack of water. I cannot help but think of the profound discomfort of living in a body that was never truly clean, of enduring the constant itch and irritation, while being forced by society to pretend that everything was perfectly refined. The fear of water was so deeply ingrained that even the most basic cleansing was avoided. A damp cloth, perhaps with a bit of vinegar, might be used to wipe the face and hands, but the rest of the body was left untouched for weeks on end. This was the foundation of Gilded Age hygiene, an illusion of purity maintained at the cost of actual health, a world where silence was valued more than cleanliness, and where the most respectable women were often the most profoundly dirty. The filth they endured on their skin was a secret everyone kept, but the poisons they willingly applied to their faces were a horror hidden in plain sight. The ideal of female beauty in the 1880s was one of ghostly pallor. A pale, almost luminous complexion was the ultimate sign of respectability and class, a visual declaration that a woman did not toil under the sun. To achieve this coveted whiteness, women turned to a cosmetic arsenal that was as dangerous as it was popular. They didn't just use makeup. They applied a slow-acting poison to their faces every single day. The most sought-after products were face powders and creams that promised a smooth, porcelain finish. What the advertisements failed to mention was that their primary ingredient was often lead or arsenic. Women would buy these concoctions in beautifully decorated tins and jars, convinced they were purchasing elegance. Each morning, they would sit at their vanities and carefully dust their faces with arsenic-laced powder, or smooth on a cream thick with lead carbonate. The immediate effect was exactly what they desired. The skin appeared flawlessly white, hiding blemishes, freckles and any hint of natural color. But this perfect facade was a mask for a process of slow internal decay. Lead and arsenic were absorbed directly through the skin, entering the bloodstream and wreaking havoc on the body. The long-term effects were terrifying. Chronic lead poisoning led to severe stomach pain, paralysis of the hands, and a characteristic blue line appearing on the gums. Arsenic, consumed in small but steady doses, caused hair to fall out, skin to erupt in sores, and in many cases, a slow, agonizing death from organ failure. Yet, as these symptoms appeared, women rarely connected them to the innocent-looking jar on their dresser. Instead of stopping, many applied even more powder to hide the very damage the powder was causing. It is grimly ironic that in the pursuit of a look that signified life and purity, women were slowly embalming themselves, their beauty rituals a form of daily self-destruction. The products were sold with a casualness that is shocking today. Arsenic complexion wafers were marketed as a type of beauty supplement, to be eaten. The ads claimed they would purify the blood and create a delicate, translucent complexion from the inside out. Women would nibble on these poisoned wafers believing they were investing in their beauty, unaware that they were systematically destroying their nervous system. If we compare this to today, it would be like a popular skincare brand selling radioactive face cream with the promise of a healthy glow. The absurdity is staggering, yet it was the accepted reality. Doctors of the era, were often complicit. While some recognized the dangers, many continued to prescribe or endorse these products. The signs of poisoning, fatigue, nausea, muscle weakness, were often misdiagnosed as hysteria or female frailty, conditions for which a woman might be told to rest more, and paradoxically to take better care of her appearance. The cycle was vicious. The poison created symptoms that were then used as justification for further social control, all while the true cause sat in a pretty tin on the vanity. The social pressure was a woman who appeared in public with a tanned or ruddy complexion was judged as coarse and unfeminine. To be pale was to be virtuous. This ideal was so powerful that women willingly endured the painful side effects of their cosmetic. They accepted the sores, the peeling skin, and the constant, gnawing sickness as the price of respectability. I find it deeply unsettling to imagine a woman looking in the mirror, seeing the visible signs of her own decay, and then reaching for the same powder pot to hide it all, convinced that the illusion was more important than her life. The silence surrounding this practice was deafening. Families watched as mothers and daughters grew weaker, their health mysteriously failing. Husbands saw their wives suffer from inexplicable ailments, but the connection to the daily ritual of making one's face was rarely. Beauty was a private, feminine sphere, and its secrets were not to be questioned. The result was an epidemic of silent poisoning, hidden behind the closed doors of respectable homes. What the world saw was a generation of women who appeared delicate and ethereal. What was actually happening was a slow, systemic breakdown of their bodies. The arsenic complexion was a mask, and beneath it, women were literally dying for the sake of an illusion. The poisons they applied to their skin were just the beginning. The neglect and dangerous rituals extended to their hair, which was seen as a woman's crowning glory, yet was often a nest of filth and torment. A woman's hair in the 1880s was her ultimate symbol of femininity. Long, thick tresses, elaborately braided and pinned, were a mark of beauty and status. But beneath the intricate updos and elegant ornaments was a reality of profound neglect. Hair was washed with shocking infrequency, sometimes only a few times a year. The belief that water was harmful to the scalp and could cause colds or headaches was widespread. Instead of washing, women relied on methods that simply masked the filth. The primary tool was the powder pot. Each morning, a woman might lean over as her maid, or she herself, sprinkled scented starch, rice powder or even plain flour into her hair. The powder was meant to absorb the heavy buildup of oil and grease, giving the hair a matte, voluminous appearance. It was then brushed through, not to clean but to distribute the powder, leaving the scalp untouched. The result was a hairstyle that looked freshly arranged but was in reality a heavy mass of old grease, sweat and perfumed dust. This unwashed environment was a paradise for parasites. Head lice were an accepted, if unspoken, part of life for women of all classes. The warm, oily and undisturbed conditions beneath tightly pinned braids were a perfect breeding ground. Women would often sleep with their hairstyles intact for several days, wrapping their heads in cloth to preserve the arrangement. This practice, intended to save time, only served to incubate the lice further. Daily grooming involved adjusting the style with combs, but these combs were rarely washed. They dragged flakes of skin, old powder and crushed lice back through the hair, redistributing the filth. It is almost comical to imagine a society that praised elaborate hairstyles while universally accepting that those same styles were crawling with insects. The solutions for dealing with lice were often as disgusting as the problem itself. Instead of effective shampoos, women turned to folk remedies. Some would douse their hair in kerosene, a flammable and toxic substance, and wrap it in a towel hoping to suffocate the lice. Others created pastes from lard and sulfur or even applied mercury-based ointments to their scalps, risking poison in their attempt to find relief. The itching could become so unbearable that some women resorted to desperate measures, like holding heated combs near the fire and running them through their hair,
hoping the heat would kill the lice in their eggs, often singeing their hair and scalp in the process. If we compare this to modern habits, it would be like trying to deal with a lice infestation by rubbing gasoline on your head and calling it a beauty treatment. The constant presence of powder and the absence of washing created a sour, distinctive smell that clung to women's hair. Perfumes were used liberally to cover it, but the combination of stale oil, scented powder and floral fragrance created a heavy, cloying odor that was hard to ignore in close quarters. Yet again, silence and respectability demanded that no one mention it. Children grew up with this reality. A young girl learning to braid her hair was also learning to live with a constantly itching scalp. She watched her mother apply powders and perfumes, absorbing the lesson that the appearance of cleanliness was more important than the feeling of it. The intergenerational cycle of neglect was passed down as a form of feminine wisdom. I cannot help but feel a sense of unease when I picture these women at social gatherings, their heads held high and adorned with jewels, while knowing that beneath the elegant facade, their scalps were a landscape of sores and crawling parasites. The hair, meant to be a crown of glory, was in many ways a crown of thorns. The weight of it, combined with the constant irritation, was a silent torment endured for the sake of appearance. Even the wealthiest women were not immune. While they could afford more elaborate perfumes and finer powders, they adhered to the same fundamental practice of avoiding water. A lady of high society was just as likely to have lice as her scullery maid. The illusion of class difference stopped at the scalp. The hair, so celebrated in portraits and literature of the era, was a lie. It was a carefully constructed sculpture of filth, a testament to a culture that valued aesthetic control over basic human comfort. The rituals that maintained it were not acts of grooming, but of endurance. As women pinned and powdered their infested hair, they were reinforcing the central theme of their lives, that suffering was a necessary component of beauty, and that the truth of the body must always be hidden. While their hair concealed a world of filth above, their mouths held a different kind of decay, one that was harder to hide and carried its own profound social shame.
The mouth of an American woman in the 1880s was often a source of chronic pain and deep social anxiety. In an age before modern dentistry, oral hygiene was a matter of guesswork and folk remedies, most of which were ineffective and often harmful. Toothbrushes, as we know them, were a luxury for the wealthy, and even then they were crude instruments with bristles made from boar hair that would often fall out or scrape the gums raw. Most women had no such tool. Instead, they relied on rubbing their teeth with a coarse cloth dipped in salt or soot. The goal was not to remove plaque, but to scrub away stains. This abrasive action wore down enamel, leaving teeth vulnerable to rapid decay. Food particles would become trapped in the roughened surfaces, and without floss or effective rinsing, they would rot in place. Cavities were not filled. They were simply endured until the tooth rotted away completely. The pain of a toothache was a common and accepted part of life. Women would suffer for weeks or months, the throbbing pain making it difficult to eat, sleep, or speak. The remedies they turned to were desperate. Some would press a clove of garlic against the aching tooth. Others would rinse their mouths with whiskey or turpentine, hoping the burning sensation would overwhelm the pain. When a tooth became abscessed, the infection would spread through the jaw, causing swelling and fever. The only solution was extraction, a brutal procedure performed not by a dentist but often by a barber or even a blacksmith, using pliers and with no anesthesia. It is almost absurd to think that a trip to the barber could end with having a tooth violently ripped from your head. Yet this was the reality for many. The most pervasive consequence of this neglect was a condition that no amount of social grace could hide: bad breath. The stench of rotting teeth, infected gums, and decaying food particles was a constant presence. It was so common that it was considered a major social affliction, a mark of poor health, and in some circles poor moral character. A woman with foul breath was often shunned, whispered about, and considered unclean. This created a profound sense of shame, forcing women into silence or to hold their hands over their mouths when they spoke. They chewed on herbs like parsley or mint, but these could only mask the underlying odor of decay for a few moments. The fear of their own breath shaped their social interactions, making them withdrawn and hesitant. If we compare this to today, it would be like living in a world where everyone has a severe untreated dental infection, and instead of seeking medical help, they just try to cover the smell with breath mints while being socially shamed for their condition. The social stigma was immense. Foul breath was sometimes linked to insanity, the idea being that a disordered mind would manifest in a disordered, decaying body. Women lived in terror of this judgment. They bought powders made from crushed chalk, charcoal, or even brick dust to rub on their teeth, hoping to whiten them and reduce the smell. These abrasive powders only scratched the enamel further, accelerating the decay. The cycle was relentless. The attempt to solve the problem only made it worse. I find it deeply saddening to imagine the isolation of a woman who longed for conversation but was too ashamed of her own breath to speak freely. It was a prison of silence built by societal judgment and a lack of basic medical knowledge. The diet of the era did not help. Sugary foods were becoming more common, and with no way to effectively clean their teeth, women's mouths became breeding grounds for bacteria. By middle age, it was common for a woman to have lost many of her teeth. Those that remained were often brown, broken stumps. To hide this, some would wear dentures, which were crude and painful contraptions carved from ivory or bone, sometimes even using real teeth extracted from the poor or the dead. These devices rarely fit well, rubbing sores into the gums and making eating a torturous affair. The unwashed, decaying mouth was a hidden landscape of suffering. Every smile was a risk, every word a potential source of shame. Women endured this reality with a quiet resignation, accepting it as an unavoidable part of life. The elegance they projected in their gowns and hairstyles was contradicted by the rot they carried within their mouths. It was yet another layer of the Gilded Age illusion, a world where outward refinement was built upon a foundation of inward decay. The mouth, which should have been a source of expression and connection, became a site of silent, private misery. And while they endured the pain of their own mouths, the very clothes they wore were adding another layer of filth and disease to their daily existence. A woman's dress in the Gilded Age was a magnificent and cumbersome work of art, constructed from yards of heavy fabric like wool, silk, and velvet. It was a multi-layered fortress of fashion. A woman would wear a chemise against her skin, followed by a corset cover, one or more petticoats, and finally the dress itself. This entire ensemble could weigh over 20 pounds. While visually impressive, it was a prison of filth. The most shocking secret of these beautiful gowns is that they were almost never washed. Laundering such a garment was a Herculean task. It required immense amounts of hot water, harsh lye soap, and days of drying time. For most households, it was an impractical if not impossible chore. Instead, dresses were worn repeatedly, for weeks or even months on end. They were aired out by being hung near a window, or spot cleaned by rubbing a stain with a cloth dipped in ammonia or starch. But a full washing was a rarity. The consequence of this was that the layers of clothing closest to the body became saturated with sweat, skin oils, and bacteria. The chemise, worn directly against the skin, might be changed weekly, but the heavier petticoats and the dress itself accumulated grime with each wear. The corset, a rigid cage of whalebone and fabric, was particularly notorious. It was rarely washed and absorbed a woman's sweat day after day, becoming a stiff, sour-smelling garment. In the heat of summer, these layers turned into a personal oven, trapping heat and moisture against the skin and creating a perfect environment for rashes, heat boils, and fungal infections. Women endured the constant, sticky discomfort in the name of modesty and fashion. It is almost comical to think of a woman fainting from the heat in a crowded ballroom, an event often attributed to her delicate sensibilities, when in reality she was likely suffocating and overheating inside her unwashed, multi-layered clothing. Stains on the outer gown were not washed out.
They were disguised. A spot of spilled tea or food would be artfully covered with a new piece of lace, a ribbon or a decorative brooch. The dress became a canvas of concealment, its beauty a patchwork of hidden filth. Over time, the accumulated sweat and grime gave the fabric a distinct musty odor that perfumes could only partially mask. The scent of a Gilded Age gathering was not just one of flowers and French perfume, but also of stale sweat and unwashed wool. If we compare this to our modern habits, it would be like wearing the same heavy winter coat, along with all the layers underneath it, every single day for an entire season without ever washing any of it. The thought is repulsive, but for women of the 1880s it was the norm. The very weight and construction of the clothing made cleanliness impossible. The long skirts of the dresses dragged on the ground, sweeping up dust, mud, and animal waste from the street. This filth would be carried back into the home, embedding itself in the fibers of the dress and the carpets of the parlor. The illusion of a clean, orderly home was contradicted by the very garments of the woman who managed. I cannot help but feel a sense of claustrophobia when I imagine being trapped inside those layers, the weight on my shoulders, the corset squeezing my ribs, and the fabric growing heavier and dirtier with each passing day. The physical burden must have been immense, a constant wearying presence. The silence around this issue was, as always, absolute. It was considered impolite to notice or mention that a dress was stained or smelled. Everyone participated in the collective fiction that these garments were pristine. A woman's respectability was tied to the appearance of her clothing, not its actual state. As long as the outer layer looked presentable, what festered beneath was a private, unspoken matter. For poorer women, the situation was even more dire. They might own only one or two dresses, which were worn until they literally fell apart. The concept of laundering them was a luxury they could not afford. They endured the filth because they had no other choice. The Gilded Age, for all its opulence, was built on a foundation of such hidden, grimy realities. The beautiful gown was a facade, a carefully constructed illusion of elegance. Beneath it, the truth was one of discomfort, disease, and decay. It was another secret that everyone knew but no one would admit. A shared hypocrisy that defined the era. The clothes that were meant to adorn and elevate women instead trapped them in a cycle of filth, making their bodies a silent repository for the dirt of the world they moved through. While the outer garments concealed a world of grime, the layers worn closest to the skin held even more disturbing secrets about women's most private struggles. In the 1880s, menstruation was a subject shrouded in profound silence, shame, and superstition. It was not spoken of, even between mothers and daughters, and the lack of knowledge created a monthly ritual of discomfort and danger. Women were taught that their menstrual blood was not just unclean, but a source of supernatural contamination. It was believed that a menstruating woman could curdle milk, spoil meat, or cause crops to fail with a single glance. One of the most pervasive and damaging taboos was the absolute prohibition of bathing during her period. Water, it was thought, would cause the blood to flow back into the body, leading to madness, disease, or even death. This superstition, unsupported by any medical fact, forced women to endure their entire cycle without washing. Instead of sanitary products, women relied on clouts or rags, typically made from scraps of old flannel or cotton, which they would fold and pin into their undergarments. These rags were by necessity reused. After being soiled, they would be rinsed in cold water, often in secret, away from the eyes of men, and then hidden away to dry in a dark corner of a cupboard or under a bed. They were never exposed to sunlight, which was believed to be a masculine force that would be offended by the sight of menstrual blood. The result was that these cloths were never truly clean. They were often put away while still damp, allowing bacteria and mold to flourish. Each month, women would pin these stiff, foul-smelling and bacteria-laden rags against their most sensitive skin. It is almost absurd that a society so concerned with female purity forced women to live in such a state of ritualized filth for a week out of every month. The health consequences were severe. The constant contact with damp, unclean fabric led to agonizing chafing, rashes, and sores. Infections of the reproductive tract were rampant, though they were rarely understood as such. Women suffered from chronic pain, fevers, and foul-smelling discharges, all of which were dismissed as part of the natural curse of womanhood. The very practice meant to manage their period was a direct cause of further illness. If we compare this to the modern experience, it would be like being forced to reuse a dirty bandage for a week, all while being told that washing the wound would kill you. The psychological toll of this silence and shame was immense. Young girls often began menstruating with no idea what was happening to them, believing they were dying or had committed some terrible sin. Mothers would pass on the necessary rags, with whispered, shame-faced instruction. The entire experience was framed not as a natural biological process, but as a secret, dirty burden to be hidden at all costs. The fear of a stain appearing on an outer skirt was a constant source of anxiety. Such an accident would bring public humiliation. To avoid this, women would wear extra layers of petticoats and sometimes even stuff hay or moss into their undergarments as an extra absorbent, adding to their discomfort and risk of infection. I find it profoundly disturbing to think of the isolation these women must have felt, enduring pain and fear in complete silence, believing their own bodies were a source of shame and danger. They were trapped in a prison of ignorance, with no access to accurate information or safe hygienic products. The silence extended to their marital lives. Husbands were often disgusted or fearful of their wives during menstruation, and many couples slept apart. The woman was treated as an outcast in her own home, her natural cycle reframed as a temporary contamination. This reinforced the idea that her body was something to be controlled and concealed, rather than understood and cared for. The irony is that the simple act of washing with soap and water, which could have prevented so much suffering, was the one thing that was strictly forbidden. Superstition was more powerful than common sense, and tradition was valued more than women's health. The monthly ritual of endurance was a defining feature of female existence. It was a secret everyone knew, yet no one spoke of. A cycle of filth and pain that repeated, month after month, year after year, in the silent, hidden world of women. The unwashed rags, and the infections they caused were just another layer of the decay that women endured beneath their respectable exteriors. A stark reminder that the Gilded Age's brilliance was built on a foundation of profound and hidden suffering. While they managed their periods in secret, the place they spent a third of their lives, their beds, was an even greater repository of unspoken filth. The bedroom in the Gilded Age was meant to be a private sanctuary, a symbol of domestic tranquility. Yet, for most American women, the bed itself was a landscape of filth that would be unimaginable today. Bed linens, sheets, pillowcases, and blankets were washed with shocking infrequency. The sheer labor involved in laundering heavy cotton or linen, combined with the superstition that too much washing was somehow unhealthy, meant that a family might sleep on the same sheets for an entire season. Over the course of months, this bedding became a repository for everything the human body could produce. Sweat, skin oils, and dead skin cells accumulated night after night, turning the sheets stiff and yellow. For women, this was compounded by menstrual blood, which would stain the mattress and leave behind a permanent sour odor. There was no effective way to clean a mattress, which was often stuffed with straw, horsehair, or feather. It simply absorbed the filth, year after year, becoming a heavy, odorous slab of compressed decay. This environment was a paradise for pests. Bedbugs were a constant and accepted misery. They lived in the seams of mattresses and the cracks of wooden bed frames, emerging at night to feed on their sleeping hosts. Women would wake up covered in itchy red welts, but the cause was often accepted with a sigh of resignation. It is grimly ironic that a woman might spend her day in a parlor filled with elegant furniture and art, only to spend her night being eaten alive by insects in her own bed. Lice and fleas were also common residents of the bedroom. They would travel from clothing to bedding, finding a warm and undisturbed home in feather pillows and woolen blankets. The pillows in particular were rarely washed
and became heavy with the grease from unwashed hair, creating a perfect environment for lice to lay their eggs. Women would rest their heads on cushions that were literally crawling with parasites. The attempts to deal with these infestations were often futile. Some would sprinkle herbs like lavender or mint between the sheets, hoping to repel the insects, but this did little more than add a floral note to the smell of filth. In more extreme cases, beds were taken apart and doused with harsh chemicals like carbolic acid, but the pests would inevitably return. If we compare this to today, it would be like knowingly sleeping in a bed infested with parasites and deciding that the best solution is to just spray some air freshener on the pillow. The filth was not limited to what was invisible. The common use of chamber pots in the bedroom meant that the smell of human waste was a constant feature of the night air. In homes without indoor plumbing, the pot would sit under the bed, to be emptied only in the morning. The odors would permeate the bedding, the curtains, and the very wood of the furniture. The illusion of a refined, sweet-smelling boudoir was contradicted by the ever-present stench of the chamber pot. I find it almost unbearable to imagine the sensory experience of a Gilded Age bedroom. The musty smell of the unwashed linens, the sour odor of the mattress, the sharp stench of the chamber pot, and the constant maddening itch of insect bites. It was a space not of rest, but of endurance. Children often shared beds with parents or siblings, exposing them to the same conditions. They would sleep on the same filthy sheets, be bitten by the same bugs, and breathe the same foul air. The high rates of childhood illness and mortality in the era are unsurprising when one considers the unsanitary conditions in which they slept. The silence around this topic was, of course, absolute. A respectable woman would never speak of bedbugs or dirty sheets. To do so would be to admit a failure of housekeeping, a stain on her reputation. So the suffering was endured in private. Women would scratch their bites in the darkness, turn their pillows to find a less soiled spot, and pretend that their sanctuary was as clean and peaceful as it appeared on the surface. The bed, the very symbol of intimacy, rest and privacy, was in fact one of the dirtiest and most dangerous places in the home. It was another facade, a carefully maintained illusion that concealed a reality of decay and disease. The women of the Gilded Age may have slept in beds with ornate headboards and fine quilts, but they did not sleep in cleanliness. They slept in filth, surrounded by parasites, in rooms that smelled of waste. Their nightly rest was not a retreat from the world's grime, but a deeper immersion into it. This hidden reality of the bedroom was a microcosm of their entire existence, a polished surface, hiding a core of profound and unspoken neglect. And this neglect was not confined to their beds. It permeated the very air they breathed within their homes. The ideal of the American home in the 1880s was one of a sanctuary, a clean and orderly refuge from the dirty, chaotic world of industrial cities. In reality, the air inside most houses was a toxic, stagnant soup of poisons and filth. The greatest culprit was the relentless burning of coal and wood for heating and cooking. Stoves and fireplaces were inefficient, spewing a constant stream of soot and ash into the living spaces. A fine layer of greasy black dust settled on every surface: the furniture, the curtains, the food on the table, and the lungs of the people who lived there. Women, who spent most of their lives indoors, were breathing this polluted air constantly. They would wipe down surfaces in the morning, only to find them covered again by evening. The soot worked its way into the fibers of their clothing and bedding, leaving a permanent gray tinge and a smoky smell. This indoor air pollution was compounded by a profound fear of fresh air. It was a widely held belief that night air was filled with dangerous miasmas, poisonous vapors that caused diseases like malaria and cholera. To protect themselves, families sealed their homes as tightly as possible, especially at night. Windows were nailed shut and any cracks were stuffed with rags. This practice, intended to keep disease out, instead trapped every form of filth inside. Without ventilation, the air became a thick, recycled mixture of coal smoke, cooking fumes, human breath, body odor and the smells from the chamber pot. The oxygen levels in these sealed rooms would drop significantly overnight, leaving inhabitants to wake up feeling groggy with headaches and sore throat. It is grimly ironic that in their efforts to avoid imaginary airborne poisons, people were instead slowly poisoning themselves with a very real and visible one: soot. The lighting in these homes added another layer of toxicity. Gas lighting, a symbol of modernity in wealthier urban homes, was notoriously dirty. The flames produced a greasy black residue that coated ceilings and walls. They also leaked unburned gas, which contained carbon monoxide. Families would sit in their parlors in the evening, reading or sewing under the bright glow of the gas lamps, unaware that they were inhaling a poison that was slowly starving their bodies of oxygen. In homes that still used kerosene lamps or candles, the air was filled with smoke and the smell of burning animal fat. The illusion of a cozy, well-lit home was in reality the experience of sitting in a poorly ventilated toxic chamber. If we compare this to modern life, it would be like living in a house with a constantly running car engine in the living room and believing that opening a window would be more dangerous. The health consequences were devastating, particularly for women and children. Respiratory illnesses were rampant. Chronic coughs, bronchitis, and pneumonia were so common they were considered a normal part of life. The constant inhalation of soot scarred lung tissue, making people more susceptible to tuberculosis, the great killer of the 19th century. Yet, the connection between the air in their homes and their chronic sickness was rarely made. A persistent cough was just a weakness of the chest, not a direct result of the air they breathed every day. I find it unsettling to imagine the simple act of breathing in one's own home as an act of slow self-destruction. To sit by the fire for warmth, knowing that the smoke was filling your lungs, to light a lamp to read, knowing that its fumes were poisoning the air. It was a world of inescapable domestic hazard. The silence around this issue was maintained by a lack of scientific understanding and a deep-seated trust in tradition. Doctors themselves often promoted the fear of fresh air, advising patients to keep their windows shut. The visible filth of soot was seen as an unavoidable nuisance, not a deadly threat. Women accepted the endless task of cleaning it, and the chronic coughs that came with it, as just another part of their domestic burden. The Gilded Age home, for all its pretensions of being a clean and moral space, was often far more polluted than the industrial city outside its doors. The very walls meant to protect the family instead enclosed them in an environment that fostered disease. The air women breathed was a testament to the era's profound contradictions, a pursuit of domestic purity that created profoundly impure conditions, and a fear of the natural world that led to the creation of an unnatural, toxic indoor environment. The silent, invisible damage being done to their lungs was a parallel to the other hidden decays their bodies endured, another secret kept within the respectable walls of the American home. And as society celebrated the home as a woman's sanctuary, it was, in fact, the place where she was most intensely and consistently exposed to the poisons that were shortening her life. The constant battle against filth and the endless domestic chores of the 1880s took a profound toll on a woman's hands. They were her primary tools, used for everything from scrubbing floors with harsh lye soap, to kneading dough, tending gardens, and handling dirty laundry. Without the protection of rubber gloves, her hands were relentlessly exposed to dirt, caustic chemicals, and contaminated water. The result was skin that was perpetually cracked, raw, and often bleeding. Fingernails, which were fashionably kept long, became repositories of filth. Dirt, grease, and even fecal matter would become trapped underneath them, creating a breeding ground for bacteria. Despite this, women prepared food for their families with these same hands, unknowingly transmitting diseases like typhoid and dysentery. The concept of germ theory was new and not yet widely understood or accepted. People did not make the connection between the grime under a mother's fingernails and the sickness that plagued their children. It is almost absurd to imagine a woman being praised for her delicious home-cooked meals,
while her hands which prepared the food were a primary source of disease for her family. The soaps used for cleaning were brutally hard, often made at home from animal fat and lye. They would strip the skin of all its natural oils, leaving hands chapped and sore. The small cuts and cracks that resulted were an open invitation for infection. In an era without antibiotics, a small infected cut could easily develop into a life-threatening condition. Women would often wrap their sore hands in rags, but they could not stop their work. The endless cycle of cleaning and contamination continued day after day. In winter, the cold made the situation even worse. The constant exposure to cold water would cause the skin to split open, creating deep, painful fissures that would bleed and refuse to heal. Women endured this as a normal part of the season, their hands a testament to their hard work and endurance. If we compare this to today, it would be like washing your dishes with industrial drain cleaner and no gloves, and then accepting the resulting chemical burns as a normal part of keeping a clean kitchen. The illusion of a woman's touch, bringing gentle order to the home, was a romantic fiction. The reality was the touch of raw, bleeding hands that carried infection into every corner of the house. The hands that soothed a feverish child were the same hands that had just handled a soiled chamber pot. The hands that served dinner were the same hands that had been digging in a garden fertilized with animal manure. I find it deeply disturbing to think of the constant, low-level pain these women must have lived with. The stinging of soap in an open cut, the throbbing of an infected finger, the rough, raw texture of their own skin. It was a silent suffering hidden behind the facade of domestic capability. The silence around hand hygiene was a product of ignorance. Women could not be blamed for practices when the science to understand them did not yet exist in the popular consciousness. They did what they had been taught, following the domestic traditions passed down from their mother. They took pride in their sparkling clean floors, unaware that the cost was their own health and the health of their families. This lack of hygiene extended to the care of the sick. A woman nursing a family member through an illness would do so with the same unwashed hands, inadvertently spreading the disease to others in the household and reinfecting the patient. The home, instead of being a place of recovery, often became an incubator for sickness. The hands that were meant to heal instead became vectors of contagion. The Gilded Age celebrated the woman as the angel in the house, the pure and gentle guardian of domestic life. But the reality of her physical existence was far from angelic. Her body, and particularly her hands, bore the brutal marks of the era's ignorance. They were a visible record of the contradiction that lay at the heart of her life, a relentless pursuit of cleanliness that was, in fact, a source of profound filth and disease. Her hands, though they created the illusion of an orderly home, were a constant hidden threat. They were another secret that the Gilded Age kept, another piece of the disturbing reality that lay just beneath its polished surface. The Gilded Age was an era of profound contradictions, a time when the gleaming surface of progress and refinement concealed a dark reality of filth, poison, and silent suffering. American women were placed on a pedestal, celebrated as icons of purity and domestic virtue. Yet they were trapped in a world that systematically undermined their health, all in the name of that very respectability. Their lives were governed by a powerful and destructive illusion that appearance was more valuable than reality, that silence was more virtuous than truth. From the arsenic powders that gave them a fashionable pallor while rotting their bodies from within, to the unwashed, multi-layered gowns that were prisons of sweat and bacteria, every aspect of their lives was a performance. They endured the constant torment of lice-infested hair, the shame of decaying teeth, and the agony of infections born from a superstitious fear of water, all while smiling politely in their parlors. Their homes, meant to be sanctuaries, were unventilated chambers of soot and disease. Their beds, meant for rest, were crawling with parasites. Their very hands, the instruments of domestic care, were vectors for the illnesses that claimed their children. The silence was the engine of it all, a collective, unspoken agreement to not acknowledge the stench of unwashed bodies, the sores hidden by cosmetics, or the filth trapped in their clothing. This silence was not just a matter of politeness. It was a tool of social control that kept women trapped in a cycle of suffering. They were praised for their delicacy when they were actually sick, admired for their composure when they were actually sedated, and celebrated for their endurance when they were actually being destroyed. I cannot help but think that the true disgusting habit of the 1880s was not the lack of bathing or the use of arsenic, but this profound and pervasive culture of denial, a society that chose to look away, to prioritize a fragile illusion over the tangible agonizing reality of women's lives. They were not simply victims of ignorance. They were casualties of an ideal that was as toxic as the lead on their faces. Their story is a haunting reminder that the pursuit of perfection can be a path to destruction, and that the most dangerous filth is not what we can see or smell, but the lies we agree to live by. The echoes of their silent suffering serve as a warning. They remind us to look beneath polished surfaces, to question the standards of beauty we accept, and to never value an illusion more than a human life. The women of the Gilded Age may be gone, but their story is a truth that deserves to be spoken aloud, a final breaking of the silence they were forced to keep. Sleep well, and good night.